Okay, well, I think we can go ahead and get started here. So welcome to the Beaver Watershed Alliance quarterly speaker series. Today we're talking about in-stream work in the Ozarks with guest speaker David Rupe with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. We want to appreciate all of y'all for joining us today, and also Beaver Water District for helping to support this program. And just want to start us off a little bit about Beaver Watershed Alliance. Our mission is to proactively protect, enhance, and sustain water quality in Beaver Lake and the integrity of its watershed. And we do that through education and outreach with landowners, cities, counties, and many stakeholders throughout the area. We provide technical assistance, and we also handle planning and analysis activities. Beaver Lake is really important in Northwest Arkansas. It is drinking water for over 500,000 people. It's a source of hydroelectric power. It brings in a lot of dollars for tourism, and it's really a cornerstone of our region here. And the Beaver Lake watershed is also a priority watershed located up here in the Northwest Arkansas region. And we're really focused on reducing sediment. So any best management activities we can do, or those research and planning analysis activities, working directly with landowners, we do a number of things to address sediment reduction. And we do have a Beaver Lake watershed protection strategy that we're currently updating. But this helps guide our management actions, as well as our 20-member board and stakeholder partners. So we do work with a number of people to accomplish our mission, and just want to take a moment and thank all of our partners and sponsors that help make our work possible. And also want to thank you for being here today and learning more about ways to help protect water quality in this area. In-stream work can be very complex and not always easy to navigate, but we're so lucky to have David here today to kind of guide us through some of the permitting processes, and also help with some other things that are going on with water regulations here in the region. So if you'd like to find out more about the Alliance, feel free to email us or call us anytime. We do have a Facebook page, Instagram, We Are Water podcast we do every month, and a YouTube channel where this will be recorded and loaded up to. So before I introduce David, just a few housekeeping things. We're in a meeting mode today on Zoom, so feel free to have your video on or off, but you will be muted throughout the program. If you have questions, you can put those in the chat box, or we can open it up at the end and you can answer or ask questions yourself here. So, okay, I'm going to stop sharing for a moment and introduce David.
All right, thanks, Becky.
Yeah, while I'm introducing you, do you want to share your screen and pull up your presentation? So David is with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. He's a regulatory project manager, and he serves in the Beaver Lake Project Office in Rogers, Arkansas. And he is responsible for permit evaluations, mitigation banking, enforcement actions, and compliance monitoring. He has approximately 18 years of experience working with the regulatory program as both a consultant and an employee. So prior to joining Corps of Engineers, Mr. Rupe worked as a project manager and ecologist at an environmental consulting firm in Fayetteville. His areas of expertise include wetland ecology, NEPA, stream ecology, ESA, mitigation sequencing, and biomonitoring. Mr. Rupe received a bachelor's degree in biology from Arkansas Tech University. So David, thanks again for being here today, and I'll just turn it over to you.
All right, sounds good. Hey, I appreciate it, Becky. So before we get started here, I want to mention that Sean Harper, he's Operations Project Manager in the Beaver Lake office. He's going to be available to discuss things at the end of the presentation that may be outside of regulatory. So if you have questions that, and you may not, but if you do have questions outside of that, he should be around for that. Kind of a quick overview of the regulatory program. What I'm going to really discuss today primarily is our permitting, jurisdiction, mitigation, and enforcement, which enforcement includes compliance and enforcement. So the Little Rock District, and it's shaded in green here on this figure, encompasses about half of Arkansas. The eastern half of the state is in the Memphis district. The southern part of the state's in the Vicksburg district. And I don't know that everybody realizes that, but everything shaded in green is in our district. We also have some additional branch offices or field offices in Branson and in Walnut Ridge. So the mission of the regulatory program is committed to protecting the nation's aquatic resources and the navigation capacity while allowing reasonable development through fair and balanced decisions. And we evaluate permitted applications for essentially all construction activities that occur in the nation's waters. That would include wetlands, ponds, and lakes. In our district, specifically in the regulatory division, we're comprised of a lot of different disciplines. As Becky mentioned, my background is more or less biology and ecology, but we also have engineers, archaeologists, foresters, environmental scientists, wildlife managers, and others. And our division is comprised of two branches: the evaluation branch, that deals with permitting and permit verifications, and the enforcement branch that deals with non-compliance and unauthorized activities. And in the branch offices, the regulatory project managers, such as myself, we work under both branches, both evaluation and enforcement. And we also have down in Little Rock a statewide transportation program manager that deals with RDOT projects. So we're going to start out talking about the two program authorities that we work under in regulatory. The first being Section 10 of the Rivers and Harbors Act of 1899. That one's been around a while. And then Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. Section 10, we regulate the obstruction or alteration of navigable waters. So that includes structures that are in, over, or under navigable waterways. And for one example of that, that's not necessarily fill in the waterway. That could be something like an overhead power line that might prevent navigation. We also regulate excavation and dredging, the deposition of material, and basically any work that affects the course, location, condition, or the capacity of the navigable waters. Now, Northwest Arkansas, we only have one navigable system, and that's the White River system. That starts, the head of navigation is approximately the Highway 45 bridge. So everything outside of that system is a Section 404. But I'll go ahead and go over some examples of activities that are subject to Section 10. One of them would be loading, unloading, like on the Arkansas River, mooring dolphins, floating boat docks, which we would see up here on Beaver Lake, piers, intake structures, dredging, and some other things. But primarily what we're going to talk about today is Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. So the Corps regulates the discharge of dredged or fill material into waters of the U.S., and this includes wetlands. Of course, there are a tremendous amount of waters that are regulated under this in comparison to Section 10. However, and we're going to talk more about this in a few slides, not all aquatic resources are jurisdictional waters of the U.S. And some examples of activities would be fields, such as those associated with commercial or residential development, stream stabilization with riprap or weirs, bendway weirs, utility line crossings, mechanical land clearing, leveling, roads, and dams, to name a few. As far as jurisdiction goes, a lot of you may have heard about the Navigable Waters Protection Rule that was implemented last year. It became effective June 22nd of 2020. In a summary, it pretty well decreased the jurisdiction nationwide in our program and allows applicants to request 3 different types of JDs. First being no jurisdictional determination, a preliminary jurisdictional determination, or an approved jurisdictional determination. And as a result of the rulemaking, our AJD numbers spiked. And that has a lot to do with the fact that a lot of waters were basically deregulated. So an AJD is an appealable JD that makes determination of the jurisdictional status of waters within a subject property or proposed project area, while a PJD is a non-appealable JD that assumes that the waters that are identified or listed on a map would be subject to jurisdiction. And as far as JDs go in relation to the Navigable Waters Protection Rule, or the NWPR for short, the NWPR regulates navigable waterways and also territorial seas and tributaries and waters to those navigable waterways. This would include perennial and intermittent tributaries. They're typically regulated under the NWPR. Ephemeral channels are not regulated under the NWPR. And that was a big change from the previous rule, because previous to that, ephemeral channels were regulated if they exhibited an ordinary high water mark. Ponds, lakes, and wetlands, they're considered jurisdictional if they're connected to a regulated water. An example would be an intermittent or perennial channel. Now, ponds and lakes constructed in uplands or wetlands or ponds, for example, that are connected by ephemeral channels are typically not regulated. And in Northwest Arkansas, as a lot of you guys realize, I mean, we have a lot of karst topography, and losing streams are really common up here. And I want to talk about those just for a minute because they do represent a large amount of what I see in a lot of the JDs that I issue. Losing streams are typically regulated within the gaining or the surface portion of the channel. Well, as long as that portion is intermittent or perennial. So the losing or the subterranean portion of the stream is typically not regulated under the NWPR. However, the reach above the losing reach, you know, the losing reach doesn't necessarily sever jurisdiction of the upstream reach. And this is something we can talk about in a lot more detail, but I just kind of hit the highlights of that. I'm also going to mention that, you know, we're living up in the highlands here for the most part. So ephemeral channels actually comprise a large portion of the Northwest Arkansas watershed. As I mentioned, those under the current rule are not regulated. And this is just a figure giving you an example of what appears to be a losing stream, where you've got surface flow towards the northeast corner of the figure that appears to go through kind of an ephemeral reach, and then it appears to have more of a surface flow as you move to the west. And here's a couple of photos I've taken recently, just giving you examples of some Northwest Arkansas wetlands. The one on the left side is a herbaceous, emergent, kind of a wet meadow wetland community. It's comprised of rushes and sedges. The one on the right is a kind of a typical forested wetland up here in Northwest Arkansas, and it's comprised primarily of green ash. And we're about to get into the permitting portion. Before I get into that, I want to go over a few of the laws that are related to our process when we verify and issue permits. The first would be Section 408. 408 refers to core civil works projects. So there are certain projects on, you know, like the Arkansas River or the White River that may be subject to 408 review. The next is the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA for short. Certain projects we deal with NEPA. It's not something we do on a daily basis. Now, Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act, that's our coordination with Fish and Wildlife Service. And that is something we do on virtually every action, at least permit action, because we have to make an effects determination and get, you know, and coordinate with the Fish and Wildlife Service for their concurrence. Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, that is our cultural resources. We've got, and that's another one we deal with on pretty much a daily basis. We have an internal regulatory archaeologist that helps us with some of that. And we, you know, sometimes have to coordinate with SHPO as far as getting clearances in regard to effect to historic properties. We also have government to government consultation with federally recognized tribes on certain projects. And finally, Section 401 of the Clean Water Act, that's your water quality certification. That one changed a lot back in 2020. And the process, as far as if a project requires an individual water quality certification, it's a lengthier process than it used to be. And on certain projects, we have to deal with, usually it's individual permit applications, but sometimes it can be nationwide permits. And that leads us into our permit types. So there's two general categories. General permits, which are programmatic, and they include nationwide and regional permits. And then our standard permits, which include letters of permission and individual permits. Our nationwide permits account for about 90% of the workload on the district. They have activity-specific impact thresholds, meaning that there's certain permits like Nationwide 29 residential development that allows up to 1.5 an acre of cumulative impact, while there's some others that may be restricted to a certain amount of cubic yards of fill, like Nationwide 18, for instance. Currently, we have 57 nationwides. There were 52 issued back in 2017. We had the reissuance of 16 in 2021, and there should be 40 more for reissuance next year in 2022. And all of these have standard general conditions, and depending on the permit and the situation or the location, they may have special and or regional conditions. They typically, not all of them, but a lot of them have a pre-construction notification requirement. And that basically means that there's a few of them that are non-reporting, while a lot of your nationwide permits do require verification or reporting to our office. And in summary, nationwide permits were designed to be more efficient processing times. Next couple of slides here just kind of gives you a list of the nationwide permits. The ones in bold are commonly used ones. The ones in red are the ones that were reissued in 2021. And some of the common ones we see in Northwest Arkansas would be oil or natural gas pipeline activities. You see some of those. See a lot of bank stabilization, Nationwide 13. Of course, a lot of Nationwide 14s, linear transportation projects. A lot of Nationwide 29, residential development. And of course, a lot of commercial and institutional development, which is Nationwide 39. And both of those are examples of nationwide permits that they allow up to 1/2 an acre of cumulative waters impact. Okay, so our regional general permits, they were developed for activities that are similar in nature. They're specific to a region. They typically have minimal environmental impacts, and they reduce duplication of regulatory control by the state and federal agencies. And similar to our nationwide permit program, they have a more efficient processing time. Now, we just have a handful of these in comparison to our nationwide permits. Some of them that you might use or might run into would be recreational facilities. If you're up in Missouri, mechanical sand and gravel excavation, or maybe repair of flood damaged structures. Now we're going to talk about our standard permits. Letters of permission are a simpler form of a standard permit when compared to an individual permit. These are used on a case-by-case basis. They have minor individual or cumulative impacts. They're typically not controversial. No public notice is required. And as far as documentation and coordination is concerned, they're much abbreviated when compared to an individual permit. Individual permits are typically complex. Sometimes they're controversial. They have the potential for substantial environmental impacts. Public notice is required. And also, coordination with multiple agencies, interested parties, and the general public is also required. And it includes a full public interest review. And these next few slides are just examples of some projects that require permit authorizations, such as trenching through a perennial stream. And of course, up here in Northwest Arkansas, we're seeing a lot of development between Nationwide 27 residential development and Nationwide 13, which is your bank stabilization. Those are probably the two most common I'm seeing right now. And one of them is due to development, and the other one's because of a lot of flooding issues we've had the last few years. The application process. So we have two different forms we use. If you're applying for a standard permit or an individual permit, you'll use engineering form 4345. If you're applying for a nationwide permit or pre-construction notification for nationwide permit verification, you'll use form 6082. And these require, basic information to get the process started. A lot of times you can include all that you need on one of the nationwide permit application forms, while with individual permits, a lot of times we have to come back and ask for more information. We prefer electronic submittals using our general inbox. This link here at the bottom of the page provides a link to our application page, and it provides our forms as well as the general inbox email address. And I'm going to try to quickly go over the permitting process with standard permits. So the first step would be a pre-application meeting with the Corps. And you'd also simultaneously want to pre-file your Section 401 individual water quality certification with ADEE. And the next step would be submittal of the permit application using form 4345. If that is complete and all the information we need is in it, we can issue a public notice. And again, that goes to interest groups, other agencies, and to the public. You'll then have a 15 to 30-day comment period. Substantial comments would be provided to the applicant. Once that's provided to the applicant, it's the applicant's responsibility to respond to the comments. And we may have to request additional information if necessary based on those comments. And sometimes modifications are needed to reduce environmental impacts based on comments received from the public or from agencies. We consider all the comments and responses. And if necessary, and these don't occur on near all of them, but occasionally a public hearing or maybe a public meeting is held. Then we then evaluate the scope of analysis, look at mitigation and related laws. We go through the public interest review evaluation, a Section 404B1 guidelines evaluation may be necessary, and of course, finally, we would make a final decision. Our public interest review includes these 21 items. I'm not going to address them specifically, but you can see there's quite a few things we have to look at during that review. Section 404B1, that's to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of waters of the U.S. through the control of discharges of dredged and fill material. Basically, fill cannot be discharged unless it's demonstrated that it won't have unacceptable adverse impacts. And we can achieve this through avoidance, minimization, and compensation. We'll talk more about that in the mitigation section. As far as making the final permit decision, we're either going to issue with modifications or special conditions, or the permit in some cases can be denied either with or without prejudice. An example of one being denied with prejudice might be for an applicant, maybe they weren't aware that the site was a deed restricted mitigation area and they applied to build something on it. That one could be denied. An example of a denial without prejudice might be where the state or DEQ denies the water quality certification. Also keep in mind that the applicant can request an administrative appeal for most decisions and or permit conditions. All right, we're going to talk a little bit about mitigation. Spend a few slides on this. Compensatory mitigation is the restoration, establishment, enhancement, or preservation of aquatic resources to offset unavoidable adverse impacts. Compensatory mitigation is required to replace the loss of wetland and aquatic resource functions and services in the watershed. And this would occur after avoidance and minimization have been achieved. So mitigation is directly related to the impacts of the proposal, and it's appropriate to the scope and degree of impacts. And we use a couple of different methods like the Little Rock Stream method and the Charleston method to assess the adverse impacts to streams and wetlands, and also use that same methodology to assess what's needed as far as the amount of compensatory mitigation. So our mitigation sequence, first would be avoidance. If possible, we request that you can, avoid waters of the U.S. using a practicable alternative with less impact or no impact. Obviously, a lot of times this isn't achievable. And then the next step would be to try to minimize your impact. Sometimes, you look at a site plan and somebody's, oh, we're going to impact an acre of wetland, and they look at it again and kind of tweak things, and well, we can reduce that down to a quarter of an acre. So in that scenario, you would still have to mitigate, because you're over, typically anything over 1/10 of an acre of impacts to waters is going to require mitigation. So the next step would be compensatory mitigation for those unavoidable impacts that remain. And we've got 4 basic types of compensatory mitigation methods. Restoration is the reestablishment or rehabilitation of an aquatic resource. Reestablishment creates an aquatic resource where one previously existed. Rehabilitation repairs functions and values to a degraded aquatic resource. Establishment is the creation of an aquatic resource where one did not previously exist. Enhancement, which is pretty common, is to improve or intensify an existing aquatic resource. An example of this might be a somewhat functional stream where you would come in and add some in-stream improvements and maybe widen the riparian zone through plantings. And finally, we have preservation, which is just that. It's the permanent protection of an aquatic resource. The first 3 here provide a net gain in resources, while preservation, it does not provide a net gain. And as far as the amount of credits that you generate using preservation, those are really small, because there's no net gain of aquatic resources in that scenario. The mitigation rule was issued in 2008 by the Corps and EPA. It was intended to promote greater consistency, predictability, and ecological success of mitigation projects. And it established a hierarchy of the preference of mitigation bank credits, in lieu fee program credits, and finally permittee responsible mitigation. It established performance standards and timeframes for decision making, and encouraged a watershed approach. The watershed approach basically being supporting sustainability and improvement of aquatic resources in a watershed to improve aquatic resources in general. And it established procedures for mitigation bank and ILF program reviews. Mitigation banks is they're, of course, a lot of folks are probably familiar with these, but they're compensatory mitigation that's conducted up front by the bank sponsor. And in general, once the bank's approved, the permittees can purchase credits from the sponsor. In lieu fee is a program involving compensatory mitigation through funds paid to a government or nonprofit natural resource management entity to satisfy those compensatory mitigation requirements. And finally, we have permittee responsible, where the mitigation is completely undertaken by the permittee. We've got some different variations there. The watershed approach, on site and in kind, and finally off site and out of kind. One thing I'll mention about the permittee responsible mitigation is that the permittee would have to submit to our office a mitigation plan that we have to approve, and it will establish success criteria that must be achieved. Typically, there would be like a 5-year, most commonly it's a 5-year monitoring period. At the end of that monitoring period, it has to be proven that the mitigation area has achieved the success criteria. If it has not, then continual monitoring will have to occur until that mitigation area meets the criteria that was established. So, and also in addition to that, I mean, all these areas are typically permittee responsible on mitigation banks. They're deed restricted, often in perpetuity. So there's a lot to go along with a permittee responsible. I just kind of want to throw that out there because there's a lot of those dotted around the landscape, but they're not as common as they once were, because there's kind of a high degree of uncertainty when you kind of undertake a project like that. As far as mitigation banks go, the interagency review team is kind of set up front, and that's comprised of different state, local, and federal entities, stakeholders as well. We have RIBITS is our regulatory in lieu fee and bank information system. You can go to this website and it provides details on all the operational in lieu fee and mitigation banks in the area. Currently, so we've got 34 banks in Little Rock District, 25 are in operation, 1 has been recently approved, 2 have closed, and there's 6 pending. In Northwest Arkansas specifically, we've got several, and they're in both the Illinois and the White River watersheds. I will point out that we've got plenty of stream credits up in Northwest Arkansas, but we're pretty low on, in general, in wetland credits. So we could use a couple of banks that have a few more wetland credits. All right, so this final section, we're going to talk about enforcement and compliance. And in my position up here in the Beaver Project Office, that's a big part of what I do, because there are a lot of unauthorized activities that are ongoing at any given time. We're going to start talking about compliance, and that is determining if an activity constructed meets the terms and conditions of the issued or the verified permit. So any given year, we're going to perform compliance inspections on several of our issued permits or verified permits. And these can be conducted during or after construction, and it ensures that a permittee complies with the terms and conditions of a permit. And this is a way for us to establish a deterrent for noncompliance and unauthorized activities, and it ensures a public interest is being protected. So as far as what we inspect, we'll take a look at the location and dimension of structures or fill to see how they compare to what was authorized by the permit. We're going to look to see if there's been any additional unpermitted work or fills that may have taken place. So maybe somebody had authorization to fill part of a stream, but they came in and crossed it 2 or 3 additional times. We're going to look for things like that. We're going to look to see if the erosion control measures are properly installed, maintained, and functioning, such as silt fences. Is the permittee complying with all the terms and conditions that were identified in the verification or permit issuance? We also look at the compensatory mitigation areas. So we'll look at the permittee responsible to see if they're in compliance. We'll also do annual inspections and walkovers on our operational mitigation banks. And in general, we're going to look at any other requirement or prohibition in the permit. As far as noncompliance resolution is concerned, if the court determines that a permittee has violated the terms or conditions of a permit, they'll be contacted and we'll request corrected plans reflecting the actual work if that's needed. And of course, we're going to attempt to resolve the violation. As far as resolution is concerned, the options for resolving noncompliance can include voluntary compliance, and that can be where, say, fill were placed in a wetland and it was simply just removed. Or maybe the same thing happened in a stream channel and you remove the fill and restored it to pre-construction contours. Another option would be to modify the permit, where the applicant would provide additional information in regard to what they ended up doing, and we could kind of, after the fact, modify the permit that way. Could be a written compliance order issued. In some cases, permit suspension or revocation of the permit may be involved. You could see Class 1 administrative penalties with fines, and in worst case scenarios, possibly legal action. Okay, we're going to move on to unauthorized activities and violations, and that is simply work or structures or fill in waters of the U.S. that don't have a permit or verification, and that would be considered violation. Unauthorized activities can be referred to EPA for resolution. If they're elevated to EPA, that would typically be a situation where you've got more of an individual permit level of impact. Violations can have serious consequences, kind of as we talked about in the previous slide, and they can be discovered a variety of ways. It could be us going out in the field to look at something else and noticing something on our way. A lot of times it can be discovered using desktop, such as Google Earth or ArcGIS. Sometimes we get calls from state and federal agencies My most common, probably most common reporting method I see is just simply members of the public, adjacent landowners that call and say, hey, this guy is working. I don't think he has a permit. And we kind of follow up with them. And this is just an example of how we could use Google Earth, for example, for instance, to kind of identify an area that appears to be a violation of Section 404. The investigation, the first thing we have to establish is the activity regulated? There's certain activities that aren't. And then next, is the activity in a jurisdictional water or wetland? And as I talked about back in the jurisdiction section, I mean, there's a lot of waters out there that currently under the navigable water protection rule simply aren't regulated. And then is the activity already authorized or could it be exempt from regulation? So there's certain farming exemptions, and there's also instances where maybe an adjacent landowner doesn't realize that their neighbor has a permit to do the work. So we're going to issue a contact letter and then conduct a site visit to collect field data. As far as resolution is concerned, corrective action can include removal of the unauthorized work and voluntary restoration. I mean, that'd be the preferred method. Is the applicant goes, hey, I didn't realize I was in non-compliance or in violation. I'll remove it. Sometimes we have to initiate legal action. And as I talked about earlier with EPA, I mean, if it's referred to EPA, it's usually a fairly severe violation, and they could be, you could have administrative, civil, or criminal penalties associated with that. And finally, sometimes we can accept after the fact permit applications. There may be some additional agreements that have to go in hand with that as well. But most of the ones that I've worked on up here in Northwest Arkansas, it's we're able to work with somebody either with an after the fact typically, or maybe with just a voluntary restoration in most cases. And that pretty well wraps it up as far as the presentation portion of it. We've got looks like about 20 minutes to answer questions. So I'm going to kind of give it back to Becky, I guess, and just feel free to ask whatever you feel like asking.